Talk shift number 1, beyond employee engagement. The compassion revolution has begun. Compassionate communication also gets business results. Kenny knows the difference between employee connection and employee engagement. He said, 9 months after I started working at my company, I walked into my boss Paul's office. He took one look at me and said, Kenny, we've got to get you to the hospital. You've got a huge lump on your neck that wasn't there during our meeting 15 minutes ago. Let's go, Paul said, and he led Kenny to his car and sped to the nearest hospital.
The doctors would later say that my boss's decision to drive to the hospital, rather than wait for an ambulance, likely saved my life.
In the short drive to the hospital, the golf ball-sized lump had grown to the size of a grapefruit. Through 4 layers of management, Dylan heard the news about Kenny.
And they told him that I was in the hospital with an unknown condition. My fiance was pregnant, and they were not sure if I would make it to our wedding day in a couple of weeks. I was 24 years old.
Dylan recalled interviewing Kenny a year before on a college recruiting trip when Kenny explained that his barely passing grades were a result of a prolonged case of mono, the impact of which had followed him through college. But Dylan saw something in Kenny. He said, my spider sense told me that Kenny was a diamond in the rough, and I convinced the VP of the department to take a chance on him. Paul knew that Kenny was from a rural town and had come to the city for the job opportunity. Dylan, a longtime resident, wanted Kenny to have the best care possible. Kenny tells it this way.
He called me after I was admitted into the hospital, and the situation was pretty serious.
Dylan asked, Kenny, can I have your permission to call the president of the hospital and have him look in on you? That afternoon, the chief clinical officer of the hospital came to Kenny's room and recommended a doctor at another hospital nearby, who was one of the foremost experts on Kenny's condition. Kenny agreed to the transfer.
And as soon as the chief clinical officer left the room, I broke down crying for the first time because I had hope.
The events of that day extended his good fortune in that nearly 10 years later, that doctor who Kenny transferred to still treats him today. Kenny told me, we named our daughter Faith because every critical step that led me to the right doctor gave us faith in the future.
Years later, I asked the executive, how did you know the president of the hospital?
And Dylan laughed and he said, I didn't. I cold called him. I left the president a voicemail saying that I had an employee in his hospital and I was concerned that he might need specialized care and might not know the best doctors because he had recently come here for a new job from a rural town and with no connections here.
I was released from the hospital, and days later, I attended my wedding. I don't tell a lot of people here my story because I hadn't been with the company long enough to get disability pay, and the company generously made an exception to some of their established policies to allow me to get paid time off during my recovery. I chose to work 60 to 80-hour weeks once I recovered to show my appreciation. When I hear about good employees complaining that the company doesn't care, I seek them out and privately tell them my story. I'm still here, literally, because of the generosity and support from my company and the people who work here. Both the people who saved my life are no longer with the company, but I am. That's the power of employee connection.
Yeah. What words would you have for leaders who may be reading this chapter?
Your value as a leader isn't in your ability to do your job. Your value as a leader is in your ability to have a big impact. You're going to be a role model in some way. How would you like your employees to treat each other in a meeting? You model that behavior. How would you like your managers to treat the people that report to them? You model that behavior. How would you like your people to feel whenever they walk out of the building? Right? You control that. You get to have such a huge impact on so many lives. You have an ability to show kindness and compassion and to not just lead your organization from a business perspective, but to lead your organization from a human perspective.
The new rules of employee engagement. Employee engagement has been a well-researched and important statistic for nearly 20 years. The Gallup organization's data on employee engagement has been used to build great corporate cultures. For the most part, The highly engaged people working for companies with great cultures don't leave to work for companies with bad cultures. So if you're already among the companies leading with employee engagement, how do you compete for talent? With employee connection. Dylan isn't the only leader who gets it. Dylan's actions bring to mind a mentor of mine, Bob Chapman. Bob is the CEO of $3 billion family-owned Barry Waymiller. He gets it. In his May 2012 TEDx talk, Bob summarized the guiding principles of leadership that they've been putting into practice since 1988. We've been paying people for their hands for years, and they would have given us their heads and their hearts for free if we had just known how to ask them and said, "Thank you for sharing." The compassion revolution is working for Microsoft too. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella is widely credited with transforming Microsoft's corporate culture from cutthroat to compassionate. In the 6 years since taking over in 2014, Microsoft's share price has increased by nearly 500%, creating over $1 trillion in shareholder value. Employee connection doesn't just work for employees, it works for shareholders too. Tom Bond is the apprentice of and living spokesperson for a quirky psychologist turned peace activist who wrote one of the most influential books you've never heard of. He's one of the pioneers of the compassion revolution. Tom is the creator of the Compassion course online, which has taught over 20,000 people about compassionate communication. And when I interviewed Tom, he asked how TalkShifts could give insight into how leaders think. I told him that many people believe that change must come from the inside out. And what makes the TalkShifts powerful is that they're tools for changing ourselves from the outside in. To shift your words requires that you shift how you think. And when you shift how you think, you'll shift your heart. And when you shift your heart, you'll win the hearts of those around you. The definition of compassion is a bit different depending on which dictionary you consult. Many definitions refer to pity or sympathy, words that typically aren't very well received in an office environment. But according to the Oxford English Dictionary, compassion is when two things converge. One, a person is moved by the distress of another person. And two, there is a desire to relieve their distress. Here's the talk shift. If compassionate communication is to relieve others' distress, how do we do it? By asking them what they need, like this. How can I support you? What ideas do you have for ways that I could support you? What support from me, from others, or from the organization would be useful to you right now? When you begin asking these questions, you will likely find that people may not give you suggestions at first. They may not share with you the support they need because they don't want to owe you something, or they may be embarrassed to ask for what they most need. Some people are fiercely independent and prefer not to ask for help. And in extremely stressful situations, the person may simply be too overwhelmed to know what support they need. So when you get started asking this question, it's often helpful to offer the person 2 or 3 ideas as a multiple choice question of sorts, like this. How can I support you? For example, we could shift tasks to another team member, adjust deadlines, or take any other suggestions you may have. When you offer your support, it's important to let go of any expectation that you'll get something in return. Ironically, when you genuinely let go of any expectations, you set yourself up for the reverse shift. The reverse shift. What if the person who needs support is you? Many of the talk shifts also work in reverse. You can reverse this shift and ask for the support you need, like this. I have a couple ideas for how you could support me. Would you mind if I share them? The reverse shift here is not a quid pro quo. If you're offering support only to get support in return, then you're not executing the shift from the right mindset. Reverse shifts are for everyone, including people who don't hold leadership titles. Talk shifts are not only used by leaders to build better bosses and become one, you can also use them to build your current boss into a better one. Even more important, and overachievers take note here, as a leader in a team or in a family, when you grant permission to others to use the reverse shifts with you, then you'll not only accelerate your own shift, but also the shift of those around you. Certainly Kenny benefited from employee connection, and it seems that the company got a great benefit too by having another devoted employee. But do you know who may benefit most from employee connection? Dylan said it best. I don't know Kenny very well, but I was the only person from the company invited to his wedding. That was almost 10 years ago. I don't remember the awards we won that year or my bonus, but I vividly remember Kenny's wedding. I remember his mother hugging me. I remember the tears on her cheek as it pressed against mine. And I remember mine on hers. So who benefits most from employee connection? Leaders. Leaders like you. Leaders like me. I would have never imagined that a cold call could change someone's life, let alone save it. I cut that out from the printed book because without the emotion, I suspected leaders would read it as self-serving, like donating money to a charity and then writing a book about it. Unfortunately, I didn't demonstrate compassion like I did with Kenny many times in my career. Looking back, if I have one regret, I wish I had done it more. I want to warn you that I may cry while reading this audiobook. And it may make you feel uncomfortable to see me cry. And in fact, you might think I'm weak because of it. But these are not tears of weakness. I've poured 4 years of blood and sweat, and yes, 4 years of tears into this book. So forgive me for crying tears of pride and tears of joy as I read it. A couple weeks ago, I caught my 10-year-old son crying. We were watching the Avengers movie, and Iron Man died. He hid his tears because he was ashamed. He didn't want his sister to see him cry. Like most men, he didn't want a woman to see him cry. And later that evening, I took him aside and I told him, "You know, buddy, it's okay to cry." And he said, "But Dad, boys don't cry." I said, "You're right. Boys don't cry, but men do." And then I taught him how to cry, like a man. Don't hide it. Just look directly at the person. Let the tears stream down your face. Do not wipe them. Do not look away. Men who cry do not look away in fear or shame. Be proud of your tears. And you know what might happen? The other person might look away. And if they do, it's because your emotion scares them. It is not you who fears your tears. It is them. Who is weak and who is strong? And so if you, my friend, still believe that looking directly in the eyes of a person, or in this case into the eyes of millions of people, if you dare to tell me or my son or my daughter that crying before millions is a sign of weakness, then let me submit to you that you have never tried it. Let's stop telling our little boys and our little girls that boys don't cry. And let's start showing our little boys and little girls how to cry, like men and like women. Let's show them how to cry with pride, with joy, and with courage. Because courageous men and courageous women do not fear their tears. They embrace them, and they embrace the tears of others. There is so much pain and anger in the world. And if there was any time when it's okay for leaders to cry, it's now. The world needs compassion. Compassion is the new emotional intelligence. Compassion is emotional intelligence plus action. The compassion revolution is coming to your world. The American Revolution had Paul Revere to warn the world that the redcoats are coming. And the compassion revolution needs more Paul Reveres. The compassion revolution needs you. Who will be the revered leader who warns your world that the compassion revolution is coming? It's time to shift the conversation. Words can shift perspective. To shift how you lead, shift your words. The world needs a talk shift. Your world may need a talk shift. Let's spark one together.